Assalamu alaikum friends, I am Areeb Rashid and welcome to the Scientific Miracles of Quran episode 19. So in this episode I'll prove through Quran that the frontal lobe of the brain, the forehead or forelock is responsible for lying and movement. It is responsible for righteousness and sinfulness. So let's begin. In 1861, Paul Broca, for the first time ever, discovered that the frontal lobe is responsible for speech production. He observed the post-mortem of two patients' brains who had lost their ability to speak. He noticed that a specific area of the left frontal lobe was damaged. This led him to conclude that the area was needed for speech production. So this is how Paul Broca, for the first time ever in 1861, discovered that the left side of the frontal lobe is responsible for the speech production. Then from 1950s to 1960s, Brenda Milner, for the first time ever, discovered the function of frontal lobe. She, for the first time ever, discovered that the frontal lobe is responsible for movement, lying, decision making, etc. etc. Brenda Milner's studies in 1960s that frontal lobe function was much more interesting than was appreciated, and her discoveries redefined our understanding of the frontal lobe. Now what is frontal lobe? Frontal lobe is the largest of the four major lobes of the brain in mammals and is located at the front of each cerebral hemisphere, in front of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So what are the functions of frontal lobe? The functions of frontal lobe are voluntary movement, expressive language, and for managing higher level executive functions. Executive functions refer to a collection of cognitive skills, including the capacity to plan, organize, initiate, self-monitor, and control one's responses in order to achieve a goal. So, and there are more functions of frontal lobe, like it is responsible for judgment, for humans' judgment, decision making, and for controlling actions such as truthfulness and lying, sinfulness and righteousness. So these are the functions of frontal lobe. Psychological factors that measure frontal lobe function include finger tapping, as the frontal lobe controls voluntary movement, the Wisconsin card sorting test, and measures of language and numeracy skills and decision making, which are all controlled by frontal lobe. The entirety of frontal cortex can be considered the action cortex, much as the posterior cortex is considered the sensory cortex. It is devoted to action of one kind or another: skeletal movement, ocular movement, speech control, and the expression of emotions. In humans, the largest part of the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for internal, purposeful mental action, commonly called reasoning or prefrontal synthesis. So these are the functions of the frontal lobe. Now, Brenda Milner has made major contributions to the understanding of the role of the frontal lobes in memory processing in the area of organizing information. Dr. Milner's seminal research has provided many landmark discoveries in the study of human memory and the brain's temporal lobes, which play a key role in emotional responses, hearing, memory, and speech. So this whole thing proves that the frontal lobe is responsible for speech, responsible for lying and movement, responsible for emotional responses. It is responsible for sinfulness. So these all are the functions of frontal lobe, meaning the forehead, the forelock, which is in the front part of the head. The frontal lobe is right here. But Quran mentions the function of frontal lobe 1400 years ago in the 7th century. Quran mentions that the frontal lobe is responsible for emotional responses. It is responsible for lying, disbelieving, meaning the belief you have. The frontal lobe is responsible for it. For example, in Quran, Surah Alaq, chapter number 96, verse number 15, which says, "Kalla la'in lam yantahi lanasfa'am bin-nasiyah." So let me translate the words. Indeed, unless he refrains, we will take him by the forelock. Then the next verse, Quran chapter number 96, verse number 16, which says, Nasiyatin kazibatin khadiyah. Let me translate it. A forlock, that is disbelieving and sinful. So Quran mentions very clearly that the forelock of a human is responsible for the disbelieving and it is sinful. Now Quran is talking about Abu Jahal. He was a oppressor who lived in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So Allah revealed this verse against him. He was sinful. His forelock. The important thing is that Quran says that his forelock is sinful and disbelieving. Meaning Allah didn't say that Abu Jahal is sinful or disbelieving. Allah said to his forelock, meaning the frontal lobe of the brain, which is disbelieving and sinful. So how could a human living 1400 years ago in the 7th century could have known that the forelock of a human is responsible for disbelieving and sinfulness, lying and righteousness? Of course, a human living 1400 years ago could not even have known that the forelock is responsible for the lying and sinfulness. The next verse of the Quran, which again mentions that the forelock is responsible for the lying and sinfulness. For example, in Quran, Surah Rahman, chapter number 55, verse number 41, which says, Yu'raful mujrimuna bisimahum fayu'khazu bin nawasi wal aqdam. So let me translate it. This is because the guilty will be recognized by their looks. They will be taken by the forelocks and the feet. So Quran is telling to the criminals who will be guilty in the hereafter. So Allah again talks about their forelock. Meaning Quran tells that the forelock of the brain is responsible for emotional responses. Meaning if a human do a crime, of course his frontal lobe is responsible for it, because your frontal lobe is responsible for lying and disbelieving, sinfulness and crimes. Your frontal lobe is responsible for everything you do, your actions. So how would a human living 1400 years ago in the 7th century could have known that the frontal lobe is responsible for lying, movement, sinfulness and righteousness? Of course a human could not have known that in 7th century. Like I said, Paul Broca lived in 1861 and Brenda Milner lived in 1950s and 60s. They discovered in these times. Paul Broca discovered the frontal lobe's speech production in 1861. Then Brenda Milner discovered the function of frontal lobes in 1950s to 1960s. So how would a human living way before than these two would have known that the frontal lobe, the forelock, the forehead is responsible for the lying and movement and decision making? Of course, a human living way before than these two scientists could not have known this fact. So I have proved that Quran mentions the forelock, the frontal lobe is responsible for lying and movement. And Quran proves that Quran is the word of God. I have proved that Quran is the word of God. So I will see you in my next scientific miracles of Quran episode. Allah Hafiz.